Today is January 20th, 2023. I want to talk about the ongoing conflict in Ukraine, and I want to talk about the ever-growing list of weapons that the West is pledging to send Ukraine. It continues to grow by the day. Since my last update, there has been a very large military aid package announced by the US. I'm going to go over it line by line. But first, I want to talk a little bit about what's going on the battlefield. What might be prompting this very clearly urgent, even desperate bid to flood Ukraine with additional weapons. And weapons, as I've explained many times, weapons that are incredibly inappropriate to send Ukraine. Weapons that are going to be not useless, but virtually useless for Ukraine on the battlefield. So I've showed you the map many times. The city of Bakhmut in eastern Ukraine, western Russia, whichever perspective you may have, it is nearly encircled. It is nearly encircled, and that is owed to Russian forces taking the city of Soledar just to the north. They continue to take territory around Soledar, and they continue pushing south of Bakhmut around to the northwest. So they are encircling the city, and it's not me imagining this. This is even the BBC admitting this. Ukraine war. Ukraine admits pulling out of front-line town of Soledar, and this is news because for a while now, Ukraine has denied that they lost Soledar. Now they're admitting it. Ukrainian forces have acknowledged stepping back from the bitterly contested Donbas town of Soledar, captured by Russian forces last week in their first significant victory after many months in retreat. But soldiers have told the BBC they've pulled back in a controlled and tactical move before a planned counterattack. Now, anything is possible, but if Ukraine is also losing territory in and around Bakhmut itself, if they don't have the forces necessary to push back against Russian pressure there, it's highly unlikely they're going to be able to launch a successful counterattack and take back Soledar. And this is actually something Ukraine says after losing every single city that they have lost, including Severodonetsk and Lysychansk, which are still under Russian control, or even Mariupol for that matter. The article goes on. It says, privately, some Ukrainian soldiers have blamed poor coordination between different units for the loss of Soledar and have acknowledged that Russia may now be better placed to encircle the far bigger and strategically more important neighboring town of Bakhmut to the south. Now, I've explained this many times. What is more important here for Russia is to encircle and trap these forces so they can capture or destroy them. Because the primary objective for Russian forces is to demilitarize Ukraine, not take large tracts of territory, but to destroy Ukraine's military. Because once Ukraine's military is destroyed, then taking territory becomes much easier. What does this represent? What does it represent that Russian forces have been able to take Soledar? Ukrainian forces are falling back in Bakhmut itself, and even the BBC, citing Ukrainian sources, admit that Bakhmut looks very likely to be encircled next. This can mean several things. It could mean that Ukraine's fighting capacity is collapsing nationwide. They simply don't have the troops and the equipment to send to Bakhmut and Soledar to reverse this. So it could mean a general collapse of Ukrainian fighting capacity. It could also mean that Ukraine is holding in reserve a large number of troops and equipment that they refuse to send to Bakhmut and Soledar because they have another operation planned. They have sent what they can spare to Bakhmut and Soledar. It was not enough. This still means that Ukrainian forces are vastly overstretched, but it does not mean that they don't have forces anywhere else. We have to be very careful about drawing conclusions based on one battle along one part of the line of contact, unless you know the disposition of both Ukrainian and Russian forces across the entire line of contact. It's almost impossible to draw these conclusions. It would be reckless to do that. So we have to keep our minds open to all of these possibilities, that it could represent a collapse of Ukrainian fighting capacity overall, or it could represent overstretched Ukrainian forces that still exist in reserve that Kiev is holding back for something else. Considering the urgency, even desperation, that the West is announcing these additional military aid packages for Ukraine, it kind of hints toward a collapse, the beginning of an irreversible collapse of Ukrainian fighting capacity. I have talked about previous, very recent announcements. The U.S. announced that it's going to send 50 U.S. Bradley infantry fighting vehicles, 100 U.S. M113 armored personnel carriers, 18 M109 self-propelled howitzers. Germany announced that it was going to send 40 Marder infantry fighting vehicles. This article by Financial Times, U.S. finalizing plan to send nearly 100 Stryker combat vehicles to Ukraine. I will get into that in just a moment. That is part of the U.S. Department of Defense's most recent aid package announced. I'm going to go over that line by line. But also in this article, they talk about 19 French-built Caesar self-propelled howitzers being sent by Denmark. I talked about 30 AS-90s from the UK. So these are 3 different types of self-propelled howitzers with more or less the same capabilities, but just 3 different chassis. The Caesar is a wheeled vehicle. The M109 and AS-90 are tracked. They have different engines, transmissions, different fire control systems. In theory, they should be able to fire the same 155 millimeter artillery rounds, but in some cases they cannot. So you can see what the problem is here. Military standardized for a reason. It streamlines your logistics. When you have 3 different vehicles doing the same thing, you need to have 3 different supply chains, and you need to have 3 different programs training operators and also maintenance crews. It makes the likelihood of these systems being used effectively on the battlefield next to zero. Next to zero. Because the reason you streamline logistics is because solid logistics means solid performance on the battlefield. And if you have complicated, overloaded logistics, then that's going to be reflected on the battlefield as well. I've also talked about the British sending Challenger 2 tanks, 14 Challenger 2 tanks. So one company, the Polish, said they're going to send 14 Leopard 2 main battle tanks. Now those are 2 entirely different types of main battle tanks, even to the main gun. They don't even fire the same ammunition, even in theory. The British gun is rifled. The German gun is smooth bore. They fire entirely different types of ammunition. So you need to set up 2 completely different supply lines for both of these tanks. The French are sending their AMX-10 RC. It's a light tank. It's a wheeled light tank. So this is a growing hodgepodge of equipment. And before I get to the most recent U.S. Department of Defense announcement, I want to show you this article from Forbes. The Ukrainian army could form 3 new heavy brigades with all these tanks and fighting vehicles it's getting. No, it could not. What it's going to do is try to reconstitute its existing brigades, which have had their tanks and other armored vehicles wiped out. The article says a Ukrainian tank brigade might have 3 or 4 battalions with between them 100 or so tanks and several thousand troops. Considering how many tanks both Russia and Ukraine have lost in the wider war, respectively 1,500 and 400. This is Forbes claiming that Ukraine has only lost 400 tanks in this entire special military operation. A tank brigade would need access to hundreds of extra tanks in order to maintain over the long term an organizational chart with just 100 tanks that are in daily use. That helps to explain why the Ukrainian army, which before the war possessed around 1,000 T-64, T-72, and T-80 tanks, hasn't been able to expand its tank force structure. This despite receiving hundreds of surplus T-72s from its NATO allies and capturing hundreds more tanks from the Russians. So this is This is Forbes wondering why Ukraine could make these brigades but hasn't. They're wondering why. The actual answer is all of the tanks are gone. And this is why the West is sending their own main battle tanks, no matter how inappropriate it is. Now, they talk about Ukraine having up to 1,000 T-64, T-72, and T-80 tanks at the end of February of last year. And some of these tanks were modernized and formidable on the battlefield, but they are now destroyed. The vast majority of that 1,000 tanks was destroyed. And then the hundreds of Soviet-era tanks that NATO sent to Ukraine afterwards, those are all gone too. This is why they are sending Challenger 2, Leopard 2, and there's talk about sending the M1 Abrams, and why the French are talking about sending Leclerc, and they've already announced that they're sending their AMX-10 RCs. They're sending these because everything else is destroyed. You would not send these to Ukraine if they still had a large number of their own tanks that they are familiar with, that they have crews with years of experience operating. You would not send this into the middle of a war for a country to use, because they're not going to be able to use it effectively. Now let's get into this this right here from the U.S. Department of Defense. This is dated January 19, 2023. Biden administration announces additional security assistance for Ukraine, valued at up to $2.5 billion US. Here is the list. I'm going to go over all of these as I always do. Additional munitions for the National Advanced Surface-to-Air Missile Systems, NASAMS. So these are the Western air defense systems that have been sent to Ukraine. The ones that have been manufactured and can be sent have been sent. And obviously NASAMS and the IRIS-T and everything else the West has sent so far to Ukraine is not helping Ukraine. Their power grid continues to disappear after every single Russian missile strike. They're also sending 8 Avenger air defense systems. The Avenger air defense system is just a Humvee with Stinger missiles attached to it. We already know that the U.S. sent huge numbers of Stingers. As a matter of fact, they've exhausted their inventories of Stingers, and it will take years for industry to replace everything that they've sent to Ukraine. And we don't really hear about the Stingers making much of a difference in Ukraine nowadays. And so this is going to be giving Ukraine 8 Avenger air defense systems that require these very scarce Stinger missiles to operate. And 8 in addition to another very small single-digit number of Avenger systems the U.S. sent previously, likely destroyed already. You need hundreds of these. You need hundreds of mobile air defense systems that can move with your forces on the battlefield to provide protection from threats in the air. Ukraine, at the beginning of this conflict, had Soviet-era systems, very good Soviet-era systems, ASA and Buk. Russia has ASA, Buk, modernized versions of both. They also have Tor, they have the Pantsir, they have Shilka and Tunguska, which are very similar to the German Gepard, this anti-air gun. And the Tunguska also has missiles. It's the more modern of the two systems that Russia is currently employing. And Russia has over 100 of each one of these systems, in some cases more than 100 of some of these systems, which just gives you an idea of how many you actually need to provide protection for your forces. 8 Avengers is not going to achieve that. And by the time the US and its allies scrape together several more, these 8, at least some of them, will either be broken down or destroyed. Next on the list, 59 Bradley infantry fighting vehicles with 590 TOW anti-tank missiles and 295,000 rounds of 25mm ammunition. So this is in addition to the 50 Bradleys they already announced, with the 500 TOW missiles they already announced. So I heard a retired U.S. Army general Ben Hodges, I think he's retired. It would be very hard to believe he's an active general saying the things that he says. And on Twitter, he said something to the effect, 500 TOW missiles equals 500 destroyed Russian tanks. And that's simply not true. And I've pointed this out many times. The U.S. Army at Fort Benning wrote a paper about how under training conditions, U.S. troops who have already received training, but they're training with their anti-tank weapons, they have about a 19% hit rate under training conditions. A poorly trained Ukrainian soldier under combat conditions is going to be hitting much less often than 19%. And so 500, 1,000 TOW missiles, we're talking about single-digit percentages of hits. And then out of that, we're not even talking about whether the missile achieves a kill or not in terms of destroying the armored vehicle targeted. And we remember the U.S. flooding Syria with hundreds and hundreds of TOW missiles and all other kinds of anti-tank missiles, and it did not turn the tide for the U.S. proxy war in Syria, and I highly doubt it's going to turn the tide in Ukraine, where a much more significant Russian force exists and is operating. The next item on the list is 90 Stryker armored personnel carriers with 20 mine rollers. And so when I first heard that they were going to send Strykers, the Stryker vehicle has many variants. And so some of them are very similar to the AMX 10RC from France. It's almost like a light tank. It has a very large main gun for a vehicle like it. It could conceivably destroy another tank with that gun. Others you can attach missiles to and other types of weapon systems. The armored personnel carrier is probably the most useless variant of the Stryker, and this is the one they've decided to send to Ukraine. So all it is yet another entirely different engine, transmission, chassis, tires, absolutely everything, just to perform the role of armored personnel carrier. So Ukraine has a menagerie of armored personnel carriers, dozens, if not scores, of different types of vehicles serving this purpose that need to be maintained, that crews need to be trained to operate, and this is what Ukraine is trying to use on the battlefield. It's not going to help. It's actually going to hinder. It is going to make the Ukrainian military more cumbersome on the battlefield. They're also sending 53 mine-resistant ambush-protected vehicles, MRAPs. These and the Strykers have lighter armor than a main battle tank. They can protect against some types of small arms fire, not all, and everything else is going to destroy these vehicles. And then this is an MRAP. It's supposed to be mine-resistant. Well, that means when it runs over a mine, everyone doesn't die inside, but the vehicle will most likely be disabled. Just to give you an idea of what they mean when they talk about mine-resistant, ambush-protected. 350 high-mobility, multi-purpose wheeled vehicles, Humvees. These are just glorified SUVs. A lot of them are not even armored. It would be like driving a SUV onto the battlefield. The ones that are armored, again, only protect against certain types of small arms. 20,155 millimeter artillery rounds. So at 6,000 rounds, so this is the artillery rounds that we keep hearing about. At 6,000 rounds per day, this is what Ukraine claims it is firing on the battlefield. 20,000 rounds will last Ukraine about 3 or 4 days. So this is not nearly enough to sustain Ukrainian forces for a week, let alone a month. And these packages usually come out once or twice a month. Approximately 600 precision-guided 155 millimeter artillery rounds. These are the GPS-guided Excalibur rounds. If you go to the Raytheon website, it says 1 Excalibur is worth 10 conventional rounds because it is highly accurate. The damage 1 precision-guided Excalibur round causes would require 10 conventional rounds. But if you take 600 times 10, that's 6,000. That's only another one single day of ammunition for Ukraine's artillery. Then they're sending 95,105 millimeter artillery rounds. This is for the smaller, shorter range 105 millimeter artillery pieces the US sent because they don't have any more 155 millimeter artillery pieces to spare for Ukraine. The whole problem Ukraine is facing on the battlefield is that they are outgunned and they are outranged. So you're sending them a gun with a shorter range. And it's not because they thought this was going to help them. It's because this is all they have to send them. The list goes on. Approximately 11,800 120 millimeter mortar rounds, additional ammunition for the high mobility artillery rocket system HIMARS. I just want to refresh everyone's memory. This is from actually AFP via France 24. U.S. ammunition supplies dwindle as Ukraine war drains stockpiles. And you can see what the date is. It's last year. And this is what it says. U.S. stocks of ammunition for HIMARS, which fires GPS-guided rockets known as GMLRS Gimlers, with a range of more than 80 kilometers, are dwindling. If the United States sent 1/3 of that inventory to Ukraine, as has been the case with Javelin and Stinger missiles, Ukraine would receive 8,000 to 10,000 rockets. That inventory would likely last several months, but when the inventory is exhausted, there are no alternatives. Production is about 5,000 a year, although the United States is working to increase that amount, and money has recently been allocated for that purpose. It will take years. So that is the situation with HIMARS. So when you see HIMARS included in U.S. military aid to Ukraine, just understand this significant constraint that the HIMARS faces. It also lists 12 ammunition support vehicles, and they don't really make it clear what these vehicles are for, but usually if you send something like a HIMARS launcher, it has to have a support vehicle, at least one support vehicle, bringing it ammunition and helping it load. Or for the HIMARS, it has its own system to pick the rockets up off the ground. But they don't really make it clear what these 12 ammunition support vehicles are for. They didn't announce 12 systems that would require them in this package. So what are they for? And the most likely explanation is they are to replace ammunition support vehicles that the US has already sent that have been destroyed on the battlefield, which is, again, why they continuously send all of this equipment. 6 command post vehicles. Again, no further details. This is usually a vehicle that would be used to command a company of tanks or infantry fighting vehicles, or even a battery of artillery. 22 tactical vehicles to tow weapons, so basically tow trucks. High-speed anti-radiation missiles, HARMS. These are for Ukraine's virtually non-existent air force. I have not heard any success at all reported by the Western media, or even a failure spun as a success. I have no idea what they're using these for, and I've already talked about how even under the best circumstances, these are notoriously hard to use to actually destroy radar sets on the battlefield. It also says approximately 2,000 anti-armor rockets. Again, they don't say what this is, but if it's a portable anti-tank weapon, this goes back to that 19% hit rate that I talked about for trained US troops under training conditions. Then it says over 3 million rounds of small arms ammunition, which always sounds like a lot when you hear 3 million of anything. But if you think about a soldier starting out with 210 rounds on them in a firefight, and that won't even get you through a moderately intense firefight. And if you spread this over a single brigade of about 4,000 soldiers, if the brigade was at full strength, this is not even going to get you through a week of heavy fighting. I don't think. Not the type of fighting that's going on, say, in Bakhmut at the moment. Demolition equipment for obstacle clearing, Claymore anti-personnel munitions, which is just another way of saying landmines for killing people, night vision devices, and spare parts and other field equipment. And then again, no details about what that entails. This is yet another U.S. military aid package that falls far short of even helping Ukraine sustain the rate of failure it is suffering on the battlefield. Is even when Ukraine is successful and it takes territory, it fails to destroy Russian forces, and it is losing brigades worth of men and equipment in the process. And this is, if you look at the vector sum of what is happening to Ukraine, its military is disappearing. And this package, along with everything else that they have announced, at best, might get them somewhere around to where they were before they launched their offensives toward Kharkov and Kherson. At that time, a lot of the equipment that they had was still Soviet-era equipment that their troops were familiar with. They had years, at least operating vehicles similar to them. They had people who most likely could have performed maintenance on them. And now all of that is exhausted. It's all gone, and they are sending them Western equipment now that they have no experience operating, no experience maintaining. Everything is going to have to go 1,000 kilometers from the front line to Poland to be repaired, and then another 1,000 kilometers back. All of these problems that I've talked about, each time we talk about these military aid packages from the West. And if Russia was able to thwart and stop, grind to a halt the Kharkov and Kherson offensives, then now they have 300,000 additional reservists mobilized. They have built these substantial defensive lines toward the approaches toward Crimea and also in the Donbas region. They are much better prepared to more effectively stop any future Ukrainian offensive, and Ukraine is now less capable when they launch these offensives because they're going to be in using equipment that they have no experience using. And then if Ukraine's plan is to use all of this equipment for some sort of offensive operation or a series of offensives, once it is gone, no matter how far back they push Russia on the battlefield, because Russia will always prefer to give up territory rather than risk encirclement and suffering large casualties like Ukraine is, NATO is not going to be able to replicate these type of aid packages. They simply don't have the amount of equipment to do that, and they don't have the annual production numbers to replace sort of losses they're about to suffer. And I've pointed out how Russia, on the other hand, between building brand new tanks and modernizing old tanks, they can put 850 additional tanks on the battlefield every single year. There's talk about Germany and the US going back and forth. Germany trying to pressure the US to send M1 Abrams. I'm sure that if everything else is gone and the Abrams is the only thing they can send, they will eventually try to send Abrams. I'm almost certain of it. And the ATACMS and everything else, they're going to eventually send all of this. It is not going to make any difference because nothing that they are sending is going to give Ukraine a capability it did not already have at the beginning of this special military operation. I've said it many times. The ATACMS is more precise than the Tochka-U, but Ukraine had Tochka-U missiles. It didn't really help them. Russia has a very large number of Iskander missiles, which are more capable than the ATACMS. If any of these capabilities that NATO is trying to transfer to Ukraine are war-winning capabilities, Russia already has them in abundance and will most certainly win the war before Ukraine does. One last thing I want to talk about, this Politico article, the link will be in the video description below, along with everything else I've referenced. Tanks, no tanks. Scholz holds key to Leopards for Ukraine, but waits for Biden. And this is about Germany telling the US to send their Abrams if they expect Germany to send their Leopards. Alexander Mercouris of the Duran was talking about this article, 1945, Bradley fighting vehicle platoon leader. Ukraine can't use them immediately to fight Russia. And if you read through this whole article, and the link will be in the video description below, it's talking about how the US has tried to sell Bradley infantry fighting vehicles to Lebanon and how they've been trying to incorporate these vehicles into their military for years, plural, to get them up and running. and to be able to use them effectively on the battleground, on the battlefield. And this reflects something that I've talked about very often, about how it takes a long time, years, to properly assimilate new systems into your military. Ukraine, I've talked about this. The Bayraktar TB2 drone from Turkey, this was a system that Ukraine bought from Turkey several years ago, before the Russian special military operation began. And it took them several years to finalize the deal, get their troops trained up, practice operating them, test fly them, and then disseminate them to the units. And of course, you can accelerate all of this. It's true, you can, but they're not going to be nearly as effective as if you take your time and do it properly. And then Ukraine, having done that whole process properly for the Bayraktar TB2 drone, it still made absolutely no difference for Ukraine, because as capable as the TB2 is, it was being used under conditions it was not designed to be used. It's not meant to defeat a integrated air defense network that Russia is using. It is meant to pick off targets outside of the protection like that. And the targets that Russia had available outside the air defense zone were just too far and few between to make any sort of difference on the battlefield. And then coupled with the fact that Russia has many means of downing manned and unmanned aircraft, all of the TB2s have been destroyed. We don't hear about them anymore. And so that is a case where Ukraine did have the time to integrate a new piece of military hardware properly, and it still made absolutely no difference. They have no time to do this properly. Bradleys, Leopards, AMX-10RCs, all of this equipment that is just being dumped into Ukraine right now because they don't know what else to do. It's not because this is the solution to the problem. It's because they can't think of a solution, so they're just dumping weapons into Ukraine. So that does it for this update. We got to keep an eye on how all of this plays out. The US and their allies, they're in Germany meeting about further pledges of military equipment for Ukraine. We still have to wait for the final outcome of all of that. I'll cover that most likely on Monday. If you thought this video was useful, please like and share. Think about subscribing. It's free to do. It helps the channel grow. Check the video description below for other places you can find and follow my work, as well as all of the links that I referenced in this video. There are also ways in the video description below to help support my work. I don't monetize my YouTube channel. If an ad ever pops up, feel free to skip it or block it, because it's not helping me out at all. And if you do want to support my work, please do so through Buy Me a Coffee or Patreon. And to everyone who has been helping out, whether it's through one-time donations, month-to-month donations, or even if you're just helping share my work with others, getting the word out to more people, that is what allows me to continue doing this work. So thank you, and as always, thank you for watching.